Uh, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Journeys, stories of faith, both new and old. Tonight, I'm going to have a little fun with you. I'm going to share a little bit of my journey and then launch into something that is a little different and see how you folks manage to wade your way through this one. My hope is on our midweek meetings that we will take you on a bit of a journey each evening. And so I'm really looking forward to what we're doing here tonight. So, uh, I think it's time for us to begin. Adam, would you mind? Would you mind have opening prayer for us? So I'm not doing all the
Sure.
praying here, and then I'll have a closing prayer at the end of our prayer time. So go ahead, Adam.
Heavenly Father, I thank you for watching over us today, and thank you that we'll be here together this evening. And may we be blessed, and as we look at some journeys together, and we thank you for your presence with us. Keep us safe and watch over us as we go through this evening. In Jesus' name, Amen.
Amen. Have you folks, I'm just going to see if you can just raise your hand as we do this. I'm wondering how many of you are familiar with let me go to gallery view here. How many of you have heard of the poem called The Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll? Anybody? Lori's the only one? Come on. Gerald, you never heard of The Jabberwocky?
Gary has his hand up.
Gary does? Oh, Gary's got a thumb up. It's magnificent, and I would encourage all of you to read it. It's from the book Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah. If you need a little context before you go to that on your own, and by the way, I'm thinking maybe what I'll do is I'll actually come back to that poem one night for one of our midweek meetings, and we can talk a little bit about Lewis Carroll, some of his experiences, a little bit of his biography. Fascinating character too, by the way. But if you want to go ahead of time and read the poem, before you do it, you might want to read Philippians 2:5-11. That'll set the stage for it. Anyway, I first read that poem, I think, in junior high. I was thinking about it today. I'm pretty sure it was in my grade 9 class, English class. And I loved it. I was instantly hooked. For some strange reason, I took a liking to poetry as a kid, which is kind of weird. Because when I was a kid in, grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, I was trying to be big and tough and burly and, make a name for myself on the campus. And so the fact that I liked poetry was a very quiet thing. I didn't talk about it to anybody. But I also loved theater and theater arts. And so people sort of knew about me that even though I was captain of the rugby team, I had this other part of me that I just loved these kind of dramatic things as well. But I've often thought that maybe it was my love of the theater arts and poetry that kind of laid the foundation, I think, for me becoming a reader. And let me just tell you folks that as a kid, I was a terrible reader. In fact, I remember once, and I'm pretty sure I was in elementary school when that happened. Yes, I was. I'm thinking back on it. Don't remember exactly what was going on in the classroom, but I was told to read, assigned a reading thing. And I said to one of my teachers, quote unquote, I would rather live life than read about it. And all the kids in the classroom laughed, which wasn't really a very good thing. You see, if memory serves, I felt somewhat emboldened by the fact that, they all laughed at that, May well have been a life-defining moment, except almost by accident, I did tentatively start to read in my high school years. And part of that was some of this interesting poetry. Now, in high school, if you'll all remember, and I did some Googling this afternoon trying to see if anybody else remembered the assigned readings when I was in high school, in the early 70s. And sure enough, I found some people who commented on who they had to read the same books that I did. I remember as a young person trying to wade through the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. How many of you folks have read that? Sandy? Yeah, Adam?
That's a very slow burn.
Oh my goodness, why in the world they ever assigned for us to read that thing? I don't know. And the other thing was the vernacular that Mark Twain used in it. I mean, I couldn't get through it. At least I don't remember.
Was getting you ready for Adventist reading.
I loved it and hated it. Maybe I could say that. Worse, in grade 11 literature class, there was Shakespeare. We spent a whole semester going through Macbeth. And I remember at one point complaining to my literature teacher, Mr. Blacklog was his name. No, that was anyway, it doesn't matter. I said, nobody talks like this. So why in the world are you making us read this stuff? So that didn't do much for me. It didn't encourage me to read. I also remember reading through, struggling through The Great Gatsby, which was one of our assigned books in high school. The Lord of the Flies. Some of you probably will remember that very dark novel. Any of you remember The Lord of the Flies? It was very, very dark. I didn't like it. Some of my friends did, but I didn't like it very much. So anyway, most of the reading I was assigned didn't help. But then somewhere along the line, and I was trying to remember today what grade it was. I haven't the foggiest. But we were assigned, or maybe I just chose, I don't know. Maybe we were assigned to read a book, and I chose Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. How many of you folks are familiar with that one? Any of you? Yeah, Bev, yeah.
Yes.
Pardon me?
I do. Perla.
Oh, Perla, yeah.
Yes.
First time in my life, in my young life, I ever remember coming to tears reading a book. I was inspired by that book. And then I tried to read Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and I drowned. I didn't make it. And this is what really turned things around for me. A friend, I think I was in grade 11, gave me his old copy of an interesting little book called The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. In many ways, that book changed my life. For the very first time, I couldn't put a book down. I even loved the poems in it. Here's a quote from The Hobbit. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to seek the pale, enchanted gold. You folks are all familiar with Tolkien, I'm sure. I talked about it last week in our worship service. That book really got me. And then I think in that same year, I found myself poring through my very first political thriller, All the President's Men. It was about the Watergate investigations. And then I read some Stephen King novels, which kept me up all night. And during those years, I also read two pop culture classics of the 1970s, and they're hardly classics, but they both had a significant impact on me. And both of them, because they had an impact on me, caused me to want to read more. Still not being a good reader in high school. In fact, to this very day, my wife will tell you, she can read a book in a quarter the time that it takes me. But anyway, I read two books in my senior years. One of them was a book from the 1970s called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Any of you remember that one? No. I think his name was Bach, I think. Had a big impact on me. And then another book, which was nonfiction, How to Be Your Own Best Friend. And I kept that book, that paperback book, for years and years and years. Had a huge impact on me. And then, anyway, to make a long story short, in my mid-20s, I purchased, of all things, a King James version of the Bible. I'll never forget going to the bookstore, feeling very awkward and strange. I wasn't raised, with any religious background. And I looked through the religious section, found a Bible, and went and paid for it. And a couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later, I became a Christian. And here I am today. And after I became a Christian, for the next decade, I read literally nothing but the Bible and books about the Bible, including, of course, E.G. White books. How about you folks? How many of you pretty much stay to the Bible, books about the Bible, and E.G. White? Most of you? How many of you? Can you just say, raise your hand and say, yeah, that's pretty much where my reading is. I can't see Gerald or Win but Perla, but I bet you maybe 50% of you or something. I don't know for sure. That's certainly where I was for a long time. But eventually, I think it was in my early 40s, I started branching out again. And at one point, I developed a list of the great books, the classics, that I promised myself I would one day get around to reading. And I call it, maybe my bucket reading list. At the top of the list was Darwin's The Origin of the Species, still sitting in my library. In fact, a couple months ago or so, somebody was in my office, I forget who it was, and they were looking at my small, meager little library there now, and they said, "You've got Darwin's Origin of Species?" And I said, "Yeah." They were kind of surprised, but I've never read it. I've had it now for a decade or more, but I've never read it, but it's one of my bucket list reading things I want to read. And then there's a bunch of other books. When I was a kid, my dad had a book that he always thought the world of. Said it was a very dark read, but he said, "My son, someday you need to read this book. It's a terrible book, but you need to read it." It was called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shire. It's on my bucket list. War and Peace by Tolstoy. I would love to read Dr. Zhivago. I don't know if I could make it through, but Don Quixote, The Divine Comedy, Moby Dick. I've never read Moby Dick. Anyway, I looked recently, but couldn't find that list anywhere. And sort of memory was that there was at least a couple of dozen, maybe 3 or 4 dozen books that I said, this is what I want to read. I want to read these books before I die. In fact, back then, I don't know if I said before I die. These are just books I wanted to read. But anyway, because I couldn't find that list on my computer, I looked at my old computer. I started to go through some of my paper journals. I couldn't find anything. I don't know where. And I started to think, well, maybe my memory is more apocryphal than real. That maybe I never actually put this list together at all. Maybe I just imagined doing that. I don't know. But one day, maybe when I retire, there is some reading I really want to get to. And here's the folks. I know I'm kind of wandering here a little bit, but the draw for me is simply to think the thoughts of great thinkers, even if I don't agree with them. I would just like to walk around in other people's shoes for a while. People whose shoes have really been somewhere I have never been. People whose thinking and lives left a significant footprint on the human story. And that means the classic books. And that, of course, means that you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to walk around in shoes that, is kind of a metaphorical thing, but don't necessarily fit, right? You're going to read things. If I read, when I read Darwin's Origin of Species, it's not because I'm going to agree with that, but I want to get inside his head. I want to get a sense of what he thought. But here's the thing, folks. I believe that God's Spirit has gone out into the world seeking hearts wherever they are. He started working on my heart long before I began calling on his name. And he did that through some very interesting means. And I'm absolutely convinced, even though I wasn't a great reader, and still am not to this day, literature, good literature, sometimes even bad literature, played a part in my coming to Christ. As the psalmist once said, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. Psalms 24, verse 1. So let me just pause here. I'm talking quite a bit. Does anybody have any questions or comments just in terms of what I've been saying so far? Okay. I'm going to read a quote now for you all, because we're all good Adventists here. And I know that this is a topic that can sometimes make people a little nervous. Okay. So let me read you a quote from Ellen White. This is from the book Education. The world has had its great teachers, men of giant intellect and extensive research, men whose utterances have stimulated thought and opened to view vast fields of knowledge. And these men have been honored as guides and benefactors of their race. But there is one who stands higher than they. We can trace the line of the world's teachers as far back as human records extend, but the light was before them. As the moon and the stars of our solar system shine by the reflected light of the sun, so as far as their teaching is true, do the world's great thinkers reflect the rays of the sun of righteousness. Every gleam of thought, every flash of the intellect is from the light of the world. What do you folks think about that quote?
Yeah, that's great. I think all good things come from him, and everything works through him.
You know, Gerald, when I first became an Adventist, I hope this is not too strong a language, but I put on the straitjacket of not reading anything or looking at anything that wasn't Bible, books about the Bible, or Ellen White. I was very strict about that. But when you read this quote from Ellen White, she seems to be saying, wait a minute. There are people out there in our world who aren't Adventists, some of them maybe not even Christians, who are bearers of light. Their ratings may not be inspirational even, but they bear witness to truth. So truth is truth wherever you find it. And does that make you folks feel uncomfortable, that where I'm headed with this a little bit? How do you folks feel about this?
No, it doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, Pastor.
It does, Perla?
It doesn't.
Oh, it doesn't. Oh, okay, good.
It doesn't for me too, because I don't really know where you're headed yet.
Oh, okay. Well, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to take you to a poem that I first read when I was in high school, but it's very dark. It's very short too, by the way. It's written by one of the great poets of the 20th century. And so maybe I should get going there. Let me introduce this a little bit. Just after the end of World War I, a Scottish poet by the name of William Butler Yeats wrote a poem. How many of you have heard of folks have heard of Yeats? Lori, anybody else? Gerald, Adam, Sandy, ever heard of Yeats? Familiar with him at all? One of the
Win has.
Go ahead, Lori. Sorry.
Win has.
Oh, Wynne has. Okay. He won a Nobel Prize back in, I think, around mid 1920s. It was part of the reason for that was with his literary and political involvements, he was able to become instrumental in the struggle with Ireland and the Irish for independence, and they gained their independence peacefully. Things didn't last that way because you know what happened with the Irish Republican Army, and Adam and I were talking about this later. Things got pretty messy. But anyway, this particular poem that I'm about to share with you is considered by many to be one of Yeats' greatest. And it borrows heavily from biblical imagery. Now, the interesting thing is that Yeats, he was raised in a Protestant home, Anglican, but did not maintain his connection to the Anglican Church. In fact, he, in his early years, according to some of the things I read, was heavily involved in spiritualism. But then, as he matured, he sort of walked away from that, but because he became much more and more involved in in political issues and so on and so forth. Anyway, here's how this particular poem, it's called The Second Coming, is described in Wikipedia. It says the poem uses Christian imagery regarding the apocalypse and the second coming to allegorically describe the atmosphere of post-war Europe. Some say it may also have been a prophetic reflection of what Yeats believed was yet coming through the remaining decades of the 20th century. So without saying too much more about that, I'm going to now share my screen, and I'm going to let our special guest come on, and he is going to, let me just see if that's the right screen. Yes, and we're gonna, I'll hopefully you'll listen to this and enjoy it. It's called The Second Coming, William Butler Yeats. Here it is.
Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Pretty dark, eh?
That's
By the
probably
way-
why. That's probably why I've never heard that particular poem by William Yeats.
By the way, could you folks hear that okay? Was it loud enough? How was it, the sound quality, Adam?
Yeah, it was fine. Yeah.
Good.
Could I play it one more time? And this time when we go through it, think about the biblical imagery you're seeing or hearing that Yeats is using. Also ask yourself the question, what is he saying? There's some very profound things that he's saying in this poem. So let's listen to it one more time, and I'll go back to the beginning, play it again, and it gives you an opportunity, because the first time it's kind of heavy to go through, and after this I can even throw up the poem itself on a share screen as well. But here we'll go back and I'll share it again for all of you. Share. Guess I'll back it up here again. I think the second coming, there it is.
By William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast? Its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
So any of you want to make any comments, anything you caught in there that kind of caused you to say, what's that about? Or that's interesting, or you know, I don't like that, or any thoughts, folks? Let me ask it this way. This is a very dark poem. But is it legitimate for men and women to reflect darkness, the darkness around them? Let's not forget that Yeats, when he wrote this poem in 1919, that was 1 year, less than 1 year after the end of World War I, which was the most horrific conflagration the world has ever known. World War II had, we dropped bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But the death toll of World War I was just brutal. And the 20th century began, with a great sense of optimism. In the Western world, at least, there was this belief that science and reason and technology would usher in the new millennia, would usher in utopia. But then World War I came, and at the end of World War I, not only was technology being used and the chemical weapons being used, and then the advent of airplanes to bomb trench lines and cities, and then came the influenza, the Spanish, what was it called? The Spanish influenza, which killed millions and millions more. I even forget the numbers now, but it was terrible. It was a very dark time, right? And do you sense that Yeats is reflecting some of that in this poem here?
No, I don't like his poem.
Horrible.
Yeah, it's very dark, and it's not an inspiring poem. What is there anything inspiring about it? Actually, I think there is.
I really disliked the line about I can't remember what it is
at the end, what rough beast?
No, near the beginning, where it talks about the normal people don't come forward, have energy, whatever, and the crazy people are all, full of passion, and I just thought, ugh, that sounds like about now.
What a profound statement. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeah, it's a very dark statement.
I found it disturbing because I feel like that's what's happening today.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Who is the body of the lion with the head of the man?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Where does that imagery come from?
From Babylon.
Yes, and think about Egypt and the
Sphinx.
the
Mhm.
Sphinx.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, so he's picking up on the imagery from there, right? And so he's talking about these troubles, and I wondered about what was he trying to point to with that. He says a shape. He says, surely some revelations hand, surely the second coming is hand, the second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image of spiritus. By the way, spiritus mundi, I looked it up in the Greek. It means the spirit of the world. Okay, so it's a Greek, a Latin, it's Latin. Spiritus mundi, sorry, not Greek, Latin, the spirit of the world. So the spirit of the world troubles my spirit, he says. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. But then he says that thing that he's pointing to, the Sphinx or Babylon or whatever it is, this ancient thing that is stone and dead, now begins to move. He says, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. It's moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. What is that? I don't know.
They're birds of carrion.
Carrion, yeah, death, right? And then the darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. Now he's using imagery. By the way, you folks are all familiar with Revelation chapter 12, and remember that what's depicted there, the picture of the pure woman who's clothed with light and her feet upon the moon, right? The pure woman, the church, as we typically interpret that, and she gives birth to the male child, right? But then, just as she gives birth to the male child, the beast there, the devil, the dragon, a serpent of old is there, seeking to devour her child as soon as it's born, right? And he's snatched up to heaven. You have that imagery very subtly being picked up on here.
Well, and I think too that it's really slanting toward the whole thing in Revelation of Armageddon, because it's talking about rocking of the cradle of civilization. You know, the Indus Valley there and all that stuff. I think that's, you know, he's sort of pointing that, you know, this is going to happen in that area.
Yeah, Revelation 16:16, Armageddon.
Kind of Armageddon thing.
Yeah.
It seems like that's what it's pointing at.
You know, folks, I've had a lot of people over the last couple of years come and talk to me casually, some not so casually, saying it's the end of the world, Pastor. And I go, and what do you think? And I say, well, yeah, it sort of feels like we're in deep, and I don't know what tomorrow brings. I'm not a prophet. But then I've said to people many times, but during the 20th century, I wonder how people felt at the end of World War I, or just prior to World War II, or during World War II. You know, how many millions of people died during Stalin's reign? In the Gulag, estimates are some 20 million people were slaughtered, and Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge, and I mean, it just goes on and on. The darkness of the 20th century. It was not a, you know, I was born in 58. I became a teenager in 1970. And for me, the 70s was just an absolutely wonderful decade. It was one of the happiest decades of my life in some ways. In other ways, it was not so happy. Great music, disco, you know, and happy days on television when I'd come home from school. And I've never lived through war. But my dear old dad, he and his twin brother both went to war, and both came back physically and mentally scarred for the rest of their lives as a result of World War II. Let me ask you guys this, you folks this, because this is a very dark poem. But a lot of the Bible is very dark, isn't it? A lot of the Bible is very dark. And when you folks look up at the night sky, let me just ask, throw out your answers. When you look up at the night sky, what is the most beautiful thing for you? What do you enjoy most about the night sky?
The stars.
The constellations, Gerald, Milky Way, maybe, if you go on
Nothing specific, just all the stars in general. It's
twinkling
just,
in the heavens above.
yeah.
Yeah, the moon, especially, at harvest time when it's close to the earth and being full and beautiful.
How many of you folks have seen the Northern Lights?
Yeah.
Have you all seen Northern Lights? Yeah. There's so many things in the night sky. Wynn's got her thumb up. I remember when Lori and I moved to Northern Alberta after seminary, and we moved up to a place called Peoria, and Northern Lights up there in the middle of the winter. It was spectacular. I'd go for walks at night in the pitch dark with our little dog. Forget what we called him now, Tippy or something, Lori, or what was his name?
Tuffy.
Tuffy, yeah, Tuffy. It's spectacular, the Northern Lights. Wow. But think about this, folks. If it wasn't for the darkness, we wouldn't even be able to see the light. So what role does it have a role in terms of our salvation? Folks, darkness and light, does darkness have a role in terms of helping us come to a knowledge of the everlasting gospel? What do you think? Anyone?
That's a good question. Imagine, and this is a human condition. If you have a pretty good life, then you don't know how good you got it.
Mm.
And maybe, you just started getting me to think maybe this is part of the whole controversy so that we know how bad it can be, so that we appreciate heaven so much more when there is no more tears or death, that we have, I don't know, maybe we won't remember, but maybe that's how we appreciate the good.
Carmen, were you wanting to say something?
Yes, Pastor. I was just going to say, in this world, yes, we are struggling with darkness because we are not wrestling against flesh and blood.
Mm.
Principalities, powers of darkness, and the light that we turn to is Christ. So we are wrestling against darkness. But I think we should be encouraged that we have a greater light that will counteract the darkness.
Yeah, absolutely. I just did a worship this morning at Lakeview Christian School with the kids. And I'm just starting my fall series with them. And I thought, well, I'm going to start talking about the Bible. And so what I did with them was I asked them all to close their eyes. And then I said, now keep your eyes closed. And I want you to, and I began by talking about how as a summer camp pastor, I spent many summers over the years being the blind camp pastor at Camp Hope at Mountain View Summer Camp. And I said, close your eyes. And now what your eyes are closed, I said, imagine that you've gone blind and you'll never be able to open your eyes again. All you'll see is what you see right now, which is nothing. And then I asked them to say, now, just imagine what are the things that you will most miss never being able to see again. And then the kids put up their hand and got all kinds of some of them were quite cute, my dog with his wagging tail, and some said my mummy's happy face, the little kindergarten girl was very cute, one boy, he was one of the kids from Lori's class from last year. He's a grade 4 kid, I think. Lori, would they
Grade
be
4? Yeah,
grade 4, the oldest. He said, and it's not word for word, but he said, pastors, what I would miss. And then he went on to use these very flowery words. He said, I will miss the look of the green fields. And he described some tree in his backyard, I think, with all these beautiful blossoms. And then he said the pond and the light shining off the pond in my backyard. And I just, my heart just went, ooh, here's this boy, describing light and beauty and how impactful it is in his life. And yeah, we are so blessed, folks, to be able to enjoy the light. And but a part of appreciating light is understanding, seeing it against the backdrop of the darkness. You know, I've preached now 2 sermons in the last little while from the book of Galatians. Magnificent book, very Paul's best book is the book of Romans, but the book of Galatians was from the gut, right? He really nailed it. But you know, he really lays down some darkness. You know, he says, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? You know, this one thing I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith?" You know, and then he goes on and talks about how he took on Peter, you know, in a public setting. Well, why did you do that, Paul? You know, why? I mean, Peter must have felt terrible when he read the letter of Galatians. You know, all the dirty laundry being aired and everything. But Paul felt it was so very important to say, wait a minute, there are some things that are really wrong. And so I think he was very mild, according to Paul, the way he talks about himself. He's very mild in person, but he wrote things very strong when he wrote letters. You know, he reserved his hard shots for the letters, but when he was in person, he was very cautious and careful with people, which I really like about Paul. But he really laid it on the line. He said, you know, guys, wait a minute here. There are some things that we need to talk about here, you know. And then he says, even I've forgotten his name now, Timothy was not circumcised. And then he talks about the Jerusalem Council in the book of Galatians, you know, 14 years, and then finally we went up to Jerusalem. And anyway, you know, he lays out some pretty harsh stuff. And when we see that, I've appreciated those words over the year, because I've often at times wondered, well, what does Paul really mean when I've been preaching kind of a little mini series on walking in the Spirit. Sometimes the best way for me to understand what Paul meant by walking in the Spirit is by looking what he says it's not. Do you know what I mean, folks? Yeah, Adam, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I was just agreeing. Yeah, you have to see what example of what not is.
Yeah. Anyway, so there we go. Yates, the second coming. Let me finish with this little bit of a testimony. I think as you all know, I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I wasn't raised in the church. Never went to Sunday school, VBSs, blah, 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 nothing. But here I was, a grade 8 or grade 9 kid, and in an English class, maybe it was history. I don't even know how this poem got into my education, but somewhere along the line, we read this poem from Yates and the term "the second coming." Well, folks, nobody in my family ever talked about the second coming. I never heard of it. Never didn't know what even that was all about. But here was Yates, who admittedly had given up his sort of formal commitment to the Anglican Church. But he's writing this poem and he's talking about the second coming against the backdrop of the devastation of World War I and maybe other devastations yet to come in the 20th century. I'm reading that and I'm hearing this phrase, the second coming. From Yates, my journey of seeds were planted for my journey of faith. That to me is God. That to me is God. God works in mysterious ways. He's able to use things that we otherwise might not like very much to shape our lives and bring us down the path towards salvation and redemption. And as Ellen White once wrote, when we get to heaven, we'll say, heaven is cheap enough. Yeah, you know. Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I had a math teacher in high school, Mr. Apatory. Not to say that Yates is this, but he used to say, if God could use an ass, he can use me. So, lots of times, there's things that we come across, things that people come across that direct them to God that are not what we would consider spiritual. But, you know, my kids hated it because growing up in my house, they were never allowed to watch anything or do anything without dissecting it as to what worldview is that and what's going on, what's really being said. And so, you know, but I think there's some value in knowing that God can use all kinds of things to draw people's attention to him. And I think people who are in darkness, the light is quite bright that shines out from those things.
Yeah. And maybe just to put your minds at peace a little bit, Lori and I, as your pastoral family, are very committed to the John Bunyan's concept, or was it C.S. Lewis who talked about ear gate and eye gate and nose gate and mouth gate, you know, to protect those gates from evil influences. So I want to at least say that as we're closing up tonight. But bottom line here, I think, is that our journeys of faith are influenced. God has a million ways to influence our journeys of faith. And as long as we keep our eyes open for the movement of God's Spirit, we will find it wherever we are. And we're able then to be a little more effective in then being able to share our faith with others. So I think that's about as far as, unless anybody has a closing question or thought. I've enjoyed this. I hope you folks have. Gives me an opportunity to do something I wouldn't normally do for a worship service. So I hope you enjoyed this. I did. And maybe we'll come to the Jabberwocky. Gerald, is that you or somebody else?
Yeah, just saying, yeah, no, I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Okay. Jabberwocky. I'll put it on my list. We'll look at that. Thanks, Win. I appreciate your thumbs up. So let's have a quick little word of prayer. Then we'll turn off our recording. And then if there are any prayer requests, I'll have a quick little benediction. Then we can have a bit of a prayer time. So let's just bow our heads. Dear Father, thank you again for loving us and for leading us in our lives. Bless our church, all those represented here, their families and friends. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.